Hello, dear mystery lovers. How are you all doing today? I hope you're having a wonderful day. Before we dive into today's thrilling story, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? What mysteries might be concealed in plain sight, just waiting for someone clever enough to uncover them? Today, I'm bringing you a captivating Miss Jane Marple mystery, set in the charming yet secretive village of St. Mary Mead. This is a tale of murder, deception, and secrets buried for centuries, secrets that finally surface when the snow melts. If you enjoy classic detective stories filled with intrigue, clever deductions, and unexpected twists, then you're in for a real treat. And if you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our mystery stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, settle in with your favorite cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to 1952, to a cold winter in St. Mary Mead, where Miss Jane Marple is about to encounter one of her most challenging cases yet. Are you ready? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Thaw. The winter of '52 had been particularly harsh in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple sat by her drawing-room window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the village slowly emerging from beneath its white shroud. The snow, which had blanketed the countryside for nearly 6 weeks, was finally surrendering to an unseasonably warm March sun. "Most unusual weather," Miss Marple remarked her faithful companion, Miss Knight, who had just brought in the afternoon tea. "One day we're frozen solid, the next it's practically spring." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, her keen blue eyes fixed on something beyond the garden. "Nature has her own way of revealing what has been hidden." As if to punctuate her observation, a commotion arose from the direction of Gossington Hall. Miss Marple could see several figures hurrying along the lane, and within moments, young Dennis, the butcher's boy, with a shrill, came running up her garden path. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple!" he called breathlessly. "There's been a dreadful discovery at Gossington Hall." Miss Marple set down her knitting with practised calm. "Do come in, Dennis. Catch your breath and tell me what has happened." The boy, red-faced and panting, delivered his news in gasps. "It's in the old fountain, miss, the one that hasn't worked for years. When the snow melted from around it this morning, Colonel Bantry's gardener found— well, he found a body, miss." Miss Knight let out a small shriek, but Miss Marple remained composed. "A body, you say? Do we know who it is?" "That's the strange part, miss. Nobody recognizes him. He's wearing city clothes, expensive ones too, from what I heard, and there's something even odder." Dennis leaned in conspiratorially. "He's got a theatre ticket in his pocket from London, dated December 15th. That's more than 3 months ago." Miss Marple's mind began to work with the precision of a well-oiled machine. "The big freeze began on December 14th, she said thoughtfully. "I remember it distinctly because it was the evening of the church social. Colonel Bantry has sent for Inspector Slack from Much Benham," Dennis continued, "and Mrs. Bantry is in quite a state. She says she's never seen the man before in her life." After Dennis had departed to spread his news throughout the village, Miss Marple returned to her window. The peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead had been disturbed, and she knew from long experience that such disturbances rarely arose from simple circumstances. By evening, Miss Marple had received a visit from her dear friend Dolly Bantry, who arrived in a flurry of agitation. "Jane, it's too dreadful," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, collapsing into an armchair. "A complete stranger, dead in our fountain." Arthur is beside himself. Inspector Slack is stomping about, asking the most ridiculous questions, suggesting we must know something about it. "Tell me everything, Dolly," Miss Marple said gently, pouring tea. "Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Mrs. Bantry composed herself. "Well, the man is about 40, well-dressed in a Savile Row suit. Dark hair, quite handsome really, though." She shuddered. "There's a wound on his head. Inspector Slack thinks he was struck from behind. And Jane, the most peculiar thing, he was carrying a photograph." "A photograph?" "Yes, of Gossington Hall itself, taken from the front drive. It was in his inside pocket, somehow protected from the weather." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking. "How very interesting! A man with a photograph of your house, arriving during a snowstorm, and ending up dead in your fountain. Had there been any unusual occurrences before the freeze? Any strangers asking questions about the hall?" Mrs. Bantry thought carefully. "Now that you mention it, there was something. About a week before the snow started, a man came to the door claiming to be researching old manor houses for a book. Arthur sent him away rather brusquely. You know how he feels about tourists and publicity seekers. Can you describe this man?" "Tallish, dark hair, well-spoken." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Oh, Jane, do you think it could be the same person?" Miss Marple smiled enigmatically. "I think, dear Dolly, that when the snow melted, it revealed far more than just a body. It revealed a secret that someone hoped would remain frozen forever." Chapter 2. The London Connection. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage, though he arrived with evident reluctance. The portly inspector had learned, through several humbling experiences, that the elderly spinster possessed an uncanny ability to see through the fog of criminal investigations. "Good morning, Inspector." Miss Marple greeted him pleasantly. "Do sit down. I've just put the kettle on." Inspector Slack cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Marple, I'm here in an official capacity. The Chief Constable suggested, that is, he thought you might have some insights into this Gossington Hall business." "How very kind of Colonel Melchett," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "I understand the victim has been identified." "Yes, that's why I'm here." Slack pulled out his notebook. His name was Edmund Blackwood, age 42, a solicitor from Lincoln's Inn in London. Quite successful, by all accounts. His firm reported him missing on December the 16th, after he failed to return from what he told them was a brief country visit. "And the theatre ticket Dennis mentioned?" "Ah, yes, for a performance of The Mousetrap on December 15th. The play he never saw, because by then he was already dead or dying in Gossington Hall's fountain." Slack leaned forward. "Here's what puzzles me, Miss Marple. Why would a respectable London solicitor travel to St. Mary Mead in the middle of a snowstorm? What business could he possibly have at Gossington Hall?" Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands. "I presume you've contacted his firm?" "Naturally. Spoke with his partner, a Mr. Horace Vine. Very shocked, very cooperative." According to Vine, Blackwood had been acting strangely for about a month before his disappearance. Secretive, nervous, making private telephone calls. Vine assumed it was a personal matter, perhaps a woman. And was there a woman? Blackwood was a bachelor, lived alone in Bloomsbury. No known romantic attachments. His housekeeper says he was devoted to his work, rarely socialized. Slack sipped his tea grudgingly. But here's the interesting bit. 3 days before he disappeared, Blackwood withdrew a substantial sum from his bank, £500 in cash. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. That is indeed significant. Was the money found on his body? Not a penny. Either it was taken by his killer, or he'd already spent it on something or someone. Tell me, Inspector, what do you know about the history of Gossington Hall? Slack looked puzzled by the change of direction. It's been in the Bantry family for generations. Nothing remarkable about it. Not the family, Inspector, the house itself. Old houses often have interesting pasts. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. I recall Mrs. Bantry mentioning, some years ago, that during the war the hall was requisitioned by the government, used for some hush-hush purpose, though she was never told exactly what. Government work? Slack's interest was piqued. During which war? The last one, naturally. From 1943 to 1945, I believe. The Bantrys were quite put out. Had to move into the dower house for 2 years. Before Slack could respond, there was a knock at the door. Miss Knight ushered in a well-dressed gentleman of about 50, with silver hair and an air of refined anxiety. Forgive the intrusion, he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of London's professional class. I'm Horace Vine, Edmund Blackwood's partner. I've just arrived from London, and the constable at Gossington Hall directed me here. He said Miss Marple might be able to help. Please do sit down, Mr. Vine, Miss Marple said warmly. You've had a terrible shock. Vine sank into a chair, looking haggard. Inspector, Miss Marple, there's something I didn't mention on the telephone. Something I found this morning when I was going through Edmund's desk, preparing for the firm's response to his death. He produced a leather-bound journal from his briefcase. Edmund kept detailed notes on all his cases. But hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer, I found this, a separate journal, written in a kind of personal shorthand. I've been deciphering it on the train journey here. And what does it say? Slack demanded. Vine's hands trembled slightly as he opened the journal. It concerns a case from 1944, a matter Edmund had apparently been investigating privately for the past several months. It involves Gossington Hall, Inspector. Specifically, something that happened there during the war. And according to these notes, he paused, his face pale. Edmund believed that a murder was committed at Gossington Hall in 1944, and that the killer was still alive, still living in or near St. Mary Mead. The room fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of Miss Marple's mantel clock. Dear me, Miss Marple said softly, how very illuminating. It would appear, gentlemen, that Mr. Blackwood came to St. Mary Mead not to commit a crime, but to solve one. And someone ensured he wouldn't succeed. Chapter 3. Shadows from 1944. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room as Horace Vine carefully turned the pages of Edmund Blackwood's secret journal. Inspector Slack had telephoned Colonel Melchett, who arrived within the hour, his military bearing somehow making the small cottage feel even more cramped. "Read it aloud, Mr. Vine," Colonel Melchett commanded, settling into a chair. Every word might be significant. Vine adjusted his spectacles and began. October 3rd, 1951. Mrs. Helena Cartwright came to my office today regarding her late husband's estate. During our conversation, she mentioned something that has troubled me deeply. She spoke of her brother, Captain Richard Brendan, who died in 1944 under what she called suspicious circumstances at a requisitioned property in Hampshire, Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Captain Brendan. Yes, I remember hearing about that. There was talk in the village, though we weren't supposed to know what work was being done at the hall. Vine continued reading. Mrs. Cartwright claims her brother was involved in intelligence work, code-breaking, she believed. He wrote to her in October 1944, saying he'd discovered something extraordinary in the old documents being stored at the Hall. Something that would change everything after the war. 2 weeks later, she received notification that he died in a tragic accident, fell down the main staircase at Gossington Hall, breaking his neck. An accident? Slack interjected. Sounds straightforward enough. That's what the official report stated, Vine said. But Mrs. Cartwright never believed it. Her brother was young, healthy, and sure-footed. Moreover, the personal effects returned to her were incomplete. A notebook he always carried, containing his observations and theories, was never found. Colonel Melchett frowned. Wartime accidents happened, Vine. Tragedy, yes, but not necessarily murder. Edmund thought differently. Vine turned several pages. He spent months investigating. Here, dated November 12th, 1951, visited the Public Records Office, found Captain Brendan's death certificate signed by Dr. Simon Haydock of St. Mary Mead. Also discovered that 3 other military personnel were stationed at Gossington Hall during that period. Major Geoffrey Strange, Lieutenant Patricia Morrison, and Sergeant Thomas Eccles, all engaged in classified document analysis. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Dr. Haydock is still our village physician. He must be nearly 70 now, but still practicing. And Patricia Morrison, that name is familiar. It should be, Colonel Melchett said grimly. She's now Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, married to James Caldwell, the businessman. They live at the Larches, just outside the village. And the others? Slack asked. Vine consulted the journal. Major Geoffrey Strange died in 1947, apparently from a heart condition. Sergeant Thomas Eccles, he paused. According to Edmund's notes, Eccles changed his identity after the war. Edmund traced him through military records and discovered he's now living under the name Thomas Eccles still, but working as... Vine looked up with significance. The head gardener at Gossington Hall, the very man who discovered Edmund's body. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Good Lord, Melchett breathed. Eccles found the body. Did the Bantrys know about his wartime service there? I very much doubt it, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. The Bantrys only returned to Gossington Hall in late 1945. Mr. Eccles was hired by Colonel Bantry in 1948, if I recall correctly. He came with excellent references from his estate in Dorset. Vine turned to the final entries. Edmund's last entry is dated December 14th, 1951, the day before he disappeared. Listen, tomorrow I travel to St. Mary Mead. I've arranged a meeting at Gossington Hall at 3 p.m. I received a telephone call this morning from someone claiming to have Captain Brendan's missing notebook. They say they've kept it hidden all these years out of fear, but recent events, they wouldn't specify what, have convinced them to come forward. They insisted on meeting at the old fountain behind Gossington Hall, away from prying eyes. I'm taking the photograph of the hall to confirm the meeting location. If my suspicions are correct, the notebook will prove that Captain Brendan discovered something in those wartime documents, something worth killing for in 1944, and perhaps still dangerous today. Silence filled the room. Outside, a blackbird sang its evening song, oblivious to the dark revelations unfolding within. So Blackwood was lured to his death, Slack said flatly. Whoever telephoned him had no intention of giving him that notebook. They meant to kill him, just as they'd killed Captain Brendan 7 years earlier. But why wait so long? Melchett demanded. If Blackwood had been investigating for months, why kill him only when he came to St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed out the window toward Gossington Hall, its chimneys just visible above the trees. Perhaps, Colonel, because the killer only learned of Mr. Blackwood's investigation when he arrived here. Or perhaps... Her voice grew softer. Perhaps whatever Captain Brendan discovered in those wartime documents is still hidden somewhere in Gossington Hall itself, and Mr. Blackwood's arrival meant someone might finally uncover it. "The notebook," Vine whispered. "Edmund was killed for that notebook, but did his killer find it? Or is it still hidden somewhere after all these years?" Miss Marple smiled her enigmatic smile. "That, Mr. Vine, is precisely what we must discover. But I suggest we proceed with the utmost caution. We are dealing with someone who has killed twice to protect their secret, once in 1944 and again in 1951. They will not hesitate to kill a third time." Chapter 4. The Gardener's Tale. The next morning, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Through her lace curtains, she observed Thomas Eccles approaching her garden gate with the hesitant boo of a man walking toward his judgment. He was a sturdy man in his early 50s, with weathered hands and the stooped shoulders of one who had spent years bent over flower beds. "Mr. Eccles," Miss Marple greeted him at the door. "What a pleasant surprise! Do come in." Eccles removed his cap, twisting it nervously in his hands. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I heard you were helping the police with their inquiries about the body I found." His voice was rough, marked by years of outdoor work. "I thought I should speak with you before they come asking their questions. They always get things twisted. The police do." Miss Marple settled him with tea and biscuits, noting how his cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "You're quite right to come, Mr. Eccles. I understand you served at Gossington Hall during the war." The cup stopped rattling. Eccles looked up sharply. "They've found that out already, have they? I suppose I knew they would, eventually." He set down his cup. "I wasn't hiding it exactly, Miss Marple. I didn't want to talk about those days. Bad memories. You understand. Tell me about Captain Brendan," Miss Marple said gently. Eccles's weathered face seemed to age 10 years in an instant. Captain Brendan. God rest his soul. He was a good man, Miss Marple, a brilliant man, too clever for his own good, as it turned out. "You believe his death wasn't an accident?" "I know it wasn't." Eccles's voice was barely a whisper. "I was there that night, you see. Not when it happened, but just before. I was on guard duty, patrolling the grounds. It was October 28th, 1944, a cold, misty evening. Around 9 o'clock, I saw Captain Brendan coming out of the library, where all of the documents were stored. He looked excited, agitated. He was carrying that notebook of his, clutching it like it was made of gold." "Did he see you?" "Yes, and he called me over." "Eccles," he said, "I've found something remarkable. Something that's been hidden in plain sight for nearly 200 years. Tomorrow, I'm going to London to verify my findings with the proper authorities." Then he went upstairs to his room. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And then?" "About half an hour later, I heard voices, angry voices, coming from the upper floor. Captain Brendan's room was in the east wing. I couldn't make out the words, but there were definitely two people arguing. Then Eccles's hands trembled. Then I heard a scream, a crash, and silence." "You didn't investigate?" "I started to, but Major Strange appeared from nowhere. He ordered me to stay at my post, said he would handle it. He had authority over me, so I obeyed. 20 minutes later, he came back and told me the captain had fallen down the stairs. A tragic accident, he said. Tripped in the dark, broke his neck, but Miss Marple?" Eccles's eyes were haunted. "The lights were on in that corridor. I'd seen them from outside. Captain Brendan hadn't tripped in the dark. Why didn't you report your suspicions? To whom? Major Strange was my commanding officer. Besides, 2 days later, I received orders transferring me to a post in Scotland. Very sudden. very irregular. The message was clear enough: keep quiet or face consequences. Eccles's voice hardened with old bitterness. I was a sergeant, Miss Marple, not an officer. Who would have believed me against a major? And Captain Brendan's notebook? Never found. Major Strange said it must have been destroyed in the fall, but I know the captain had it when he went upstairs. Someone took it. Miss Marple poured more tea, her mind working methodically. Mr. Eccles, when did you return to Gossington Hall? In 1948. After the war, I tried various jobs, but nothing suited me like gardening. When I heard Colonel Bantry was looking for a head gardener, I applied. I know what you're thinking. Why come back to a place with such terrible memories, but— He paused, choosing his words carefully. I suppose I felt I owed something to Captain Brendan. Someone should remember what happened to him. Someone should keep watch. Keep watch for what? Eccles met her gaze directly. For the truth to surface, Miss Marple. I always believed that one day somehow the truth would come out. And when that solicitor fellow showed up in December, asking to meet at the fountain, I wondered if that day had finally arrived. Miss Marple's needles stopped clicking. You knew Mr. Blackwood was coming? Not his name, no, but the day before the big freeze started, I received an anonymous note pushed under my cottage door. It said a London solicitor would be visiting Gossington Hall the next day, asking questions about 1944, and that I should remember my duty to stay silent. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. It was a warning. From whom? That's what I've been trying to work out, Miss Marple. Major Strange is dead, but Lieutenant Morrison, Mrs. Caldwell now, she's still here. And Dr. Haydock, he was the one who signed the death certificate, called it an accident when he must have known something was wrong. Why must he have known? Eccles's voice dropped even lower. Because Captain Brendan had bruises on his throat, Miss Marple. I saw them when they carried his body past me. You don't get bruises like that from falling downstairs. You get them from being strangled first, then thrown down to make it look like an accident. The clock chimed 11, its sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Mr. Eccles, Miss Marple said finally, you've been very brave to come here and tell me this, but you must be careful. If the killer discovered Mr. Blackwood's investigation, they may know you've been speaking to me. I'm not afraid anymore, Miss Marple. I'm 53 years old, and I've lived with this secret for 8 years. If telling the truth puts me in danger, so be it. Captain Brendan deserves justice, and so does that poor solicitor who died trying to find it. After Eccles departed, Miss Marple sat for a long time at her window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. 2 murders, 8 years apart, both connected to whatever Captain Brendan had discovered in those wartime documents. There's something hidden for 200 years, Eccles had said. What could possibly be worth killing for after so long? The answer, she suspected, lay somewhere in Gossington Hall, in its library, its walls, or perhaps in the memories of those who had been there that fateful October night in 1944. And one of those people was a killer. Chapter 5. The Lieutenant's Memory. Mrs. Patricia Caldwell arrived for afternoon tea at Miss Marple's cottage, with the practised grace of one accustomed to social obligations. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a burgundy suit with pearls at her throat. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen observer's eye, noted the tightness around Mrs. Caldwell's mouth and the way her gloved hands gripped her handbag. A touch too firmly. "How kind of you to invite me, Miss Marple," Mrs. Caldwell said, settling into the chintz armchair, "though I confess I'm puzzled by the occasion. We've been neighbours for years, but have rarely socialised." "How remiss of me," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, pouring tea. "I've been thinking about the war years lately. So much has been in the newspapers about those times. I understand you served at Gossington Hall during the conflict." Mrs. Caldwell's cup paused halfway to her lips. "My wartime service is hardly common knowledge. How did you learn of it?" "In a village like St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Caldwell, very little remains secret forever. Especially now, with poor Mr. G. Blackwood's death bringing the past back to light. I had nothing to do with that man's death." The words came out too quickly, too defensively. Mrs. Caldwell set down her cup with a sharp click. "I didn't even know he existed until the police came asking their impertinent questions." "Of course not, dear," Miss Marple soothed. "But you did know Captain Brendan, didn't you?" The colour drained from Mrs. Caldwell's face. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of rising and leaving. Then, as if a dam had broken, she slumped back in her chair. "Richard Brendan," she whispered. "I haven't spoken that name aloud in 8 years. How did you know?" "I know very little, actually. That's why I hoped you might enlighten me." Mrs. Caldwell stared into her teacup as if reading her past in its depths. "We were so young then. I was barely 23, fresh from my training at Bletchley Park. Richard was 30, brilliant, passionate about his work. We were assigned to document analysis, sorting through centuries of papers seized from occupied territories, looking for intelligence value. And you became close?" A ghost of a smile touched Mrs. Caldwell's lips. "We fell in love. It was forbidden, of course. Fraternization between officers was discouraged. But in those days, with death all around us, we took what happiness we could find. We planned to marry after the war." Her voice hardened. "That never happened." "His death must have been devastating." "It destroyed me." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes glistened. "But not just because I lost him. Because I knew it wasn't an accident, and there was nothing I could do about it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What did you know, Mrs. Caldwell?" Richard had been working late in the library for weeks, going through a collection of 18th century documents from a French chateau. He was excited about something he'd found, but he wouldn't tell me what. Said it was too dangerous, that he needed to verify his discovery before involving anyone else. The night he died. Her voice broke. The night he died, we'd arranged to meet in the library at 10 o'clock. He'd promised to finally share his discovery with me. But you never met. I was delayed. There was an air raid drill, and I was required to supervise the securing of documents. By the time I reached the library, it was 10:15. Richard wasn't there. I went looking for him and found— She paused, struggling with the memory. I found Major Strange standing at the bottom of the main staircase, with Richard's body at his feet. What did Major Strange say? He told me Richard had fallen, that it was a tragic accident. But Miss Marple, Richard's notebook was clutched in the Major's hand, not Richard's. And the Major was burning pages from it in the library fireplace when I arrived. I could see the flames through the open door. Did you confront him? I tried. I was hysterical, demanding to know what happened, why he was burning Richard's work. The Major— Mrs. Caldwell's hands trembled. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and told me that Captain Brendan had discovered classified information that threatened national security. He said Richard's death was regrettable but necessary, and that if I valued my life and my family's safety, I would forget everything I'd seen and heard that night. Miss Marple's needles had stopped entirely. He admitted to murder? Not in so many words, but the implication was clear. I was terrified, Miss Marple. The next day, Dr. Haydock examined Richard's body and signed the death certificate without question. Major Strange had powerful connections. He'd made that abundantly clear. Who would believe a young lieutenant over a decorated major with friends in high places? So, you remained silent. What choice did I have? I was transferred to London a week later. I never returned to Gossington Hall, never spoke of that night to anyone. I met James Caldwell in 1946, married him, and tried to build a new life. When we moved to St. Mary Mead in 1949, I had no idea Gossington Hall was so close. By then, the Bantrys had reclaimed it, and I thought, I hoped, the past was truly buried. Yet here we are, Miss Marple observed gently, with that past literally emerging from the snow. Mrs. Caldwell's composure finally cracked. Tears rolled down her cheeks. When I heard about the solicitor's body, I knew immediately it was connected to Richard. Someone is still protecting whatever secret he died for. And now, I'm terrified all over again, because whoever killed Richard and that solicitor knows I was there that night. I'm a loose end, Miss Marple. A witness who could destroy them. Have you received any threats? Not directly, but 3 days ago, I found something in my Morning Post, a newspaper clipping about Mr. Blackwood's death, with a single sentence written across it. Some secrets should stay buried. She pulled a folded paper from her handbag with shaking hands. I didn't show it to the police. I was too frightened. Miss Marple examined the clipping. The handwriting was disguised as deliberate block capitals in black ink. Mrs. Caldwell, I must ask you something of vital importance. Did Richard ever mention specifically what he'd found in those French documents? Mrs. Caldwell wiped her eyes, thinking carefully. He only said one thing clearly, the day before he died. He told me he'd discovered proof that a great historical injustice had been perpetrated and that certain powerful people, or their descendants, would go to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden. He said it involved— She frowned, concentrating. A substitution. That was the word he used, a substitution. But he died before he could explain what he meant. And Major Strange, what became of him after the war? He died in 1947, supposedly of a heart condition, but I've always wondered. Mrs. Caldwell met Miss Marple's eyes. I've always wondered if he died naturally, or if someone decided he too knew too much. As Mrs. Caldwell departed, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the shadows lengthen across St. Mary Mead. A substitution, Captain Brendan had said, a secret hidden for 200 years, involving French documents and powerful families. And Dr. Haydock, who had signed a false death certificate in 1944, was still very much alive. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to pay a visit to the village physician. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Dilemma. Dr. Jechim. Simon Haydock's surgery occupied a converted Georgian house on the High Street, its brass nameplate polished to a mirror shine, despite the building's evident age. Miss Marple arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, the hour when the doctor traditionally finished his afternoon consultations. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brent, showed her into the consulting room where Dr. Haydock sat behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by medical journals and case files. He was a tall, spare man with silver hair and the penetrating gaze of one accustomed to diagnosing ailments, both physical and moral. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with old-fashioned courtesy, "this is unexpected. Are you unwell?" "Quite well, thank you, Doctor, though I fear the same cannot be said for the moral health of our village." Miss Marple settled herself without preamble. "I've come to discuss Captain Richard Brendan." Dr. Haydock's face became a careful mask. He resumed his seat slowly. That was 8 years ago. Ancient history. Murder, Dr. Haydock, is never ancient history. It remains contemporary until justice is served. Murder! The doctor's voice was sharp. Captain Brendan's death was a tragic accident. I examined the body myself and signed the certificate accordingly. You signed a false certificate. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but implacable. You knew perfectly well that Captain Brendan had been strangled before being thrown down those stairs. The bruising on his throat would have told you that. For a long moment, Dr. Haydock said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he opened a locked drawer in his desk and withdrew a yellowed file folder. I've kept these all these years, he said quietly. My original notes from that examination. Notes I was ordered to destroy but couldn't bring myself to eliminate entirely. He spread several pages across the desk. Miss Marple leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the medical observations. Contusions consistent with manual strangulation, she read aloud. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, defensive wounds on the hands and forearms, and here, cervical fracture compatible with fall, but strangulation injuries occurred ante mortem. Dr. Haydock, this is a complete autopsy report indicating deliberate homicide. I know what it says, the doctor replied bitterly. I wrote it. And then I was told by Major Strange to write something entirely different for the official record. Why did you comply? Dr. Haydock rose and walked to the window, his back to Miss Marple. Because I was a coward, Miss Marple. A contemptible, self-preserving coward. His voice was laden with self-loathing. Major Strange came to me the morning after Brendan's death. He brought someone with him. A man in civilian clothes who never gave his name, but carried credentials, identifying him as military intelligence. They told me that Captain Brendan had discovered information that compromised national security, information so sensitive that his death had been sanctioned at the highest levels. You believed them? I didn't know what to believe. We were at war, Miss Marple. Strange things happened in the name of national security. They showed me documents, official-looking papers with impressive seals and signatures. They told me that if I revealed the true cause of death, I would be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, possibly imprisoned, certainly struck off the medical register. He turned back to face her, his eyes haunted. I had a wife and 2 young children. I convinced myself that if the order truly came from the top, then perhaps Brendan's death, however tragic, served some greater purpose. But you kept your original notes. Yes. As the years passed and I learned more about what had actually transpired at Gossington Hall, I realized I'd been used. Major Strange had lied to me. There was no national security issue, only a private crime he was desperate to conceal. Dr. Haydock returned to his desk, sinking into his chair like a man carrying an unbearable weight. I've lived with that guilt every day since. Miss Marple studied the elderly physician with a mixture of sympathy and steel. Tell me about Major Strange. What kind of man was he? Ambitious, ruthless, charming when it suited him. He came from an old family, the Stranges of Wiltshire, minor aristocracy with pretensions to greater significance. During the war, he used his position at Gossington Hall to ingratiate himself with powerful people. He spoke often of his family's history, their connections to important events. He was obsessed with maintaining the family reputation. And after the war, he retired to the family estate in Wiltshire. I heard he married well, some connection to a banking family. Then, in 1947, I received word that he'd died suddenly of heart failure. Dr. Haydock met Miss Marple's eyes significantly. I wasn't asked to examine that body, but I've always wondered if his death was quite as natural as reported. Who would have wanted him dead? Perhaps someone who feared he might eventually confess, or someone who wanted to ensure he could never reveal what Captain Brendan had discovered. Major Strange was the type to keep insurance, documents, evidence, in case he ever needed leverage. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Dr. Haydock, do you know what became of Major Strange's personal effects? His papers? His widow inherited everything, I assume. She remarried a few years later, a businessman named. He paused, thinking, Thornton, I believe, Arthur Thornton. They moved to London. And did Major Strange have any children? A son, Geoffrey Strange Jr. He would be in his 30s now. I heard he went into finance, like his stepfather. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. One more question, Doctor. Did you ever learn what Captain Brendan discovered in those French documents? Dr. Haydock shook his head. Major Strange never told me, but I remember something odd. The morning after the murder, when Strange came to my surgery, he was carrying a large envelope marked with the Gossington Hall seal. Inside were what appeared to be genealogical charts, family trees, old documents in French. He asked me to destroy them, said they were part of the sensitive material Brendan had been reviewing. I refused. I'd already compromised myself enough. He burned them in my fireplace while I watched, but not before I glimpsed one of the charts. What did you see? 2 family trees side by side. One was labelled Strange and traced back to the early 18th century. The other was labelled Gossington and showed the Bantry family lineage. But there was something peculiar about the connections between them. Lines drawn in red ink, with question marks and annotations I couldn't quite read before Strange snatched the papers away. Strange and Gossington families connected, Miss Marple murmured. How very interesting. There's something else, Dr. Haydock added reluctantly. Among the papers Strange burned, I saw a name that struck me. Laurent Beaumont, Chevalier de Rossignol. It meant nothing to me at the time, but years later I happened upon a book about the French aristocracy. Laurent Beaumont was a minor French nobleman who disappeared in 1743 during a scandal involving a substituted heir. The case was never solved. A substitution, Miss Marple said softly, remembering Mrs. Caldwell's words. Dr. Haydock, I believe Captain Brendan discovered proof that the Strange family, or perhaps another family entirely, had perpetrated a massive fraud 200 years ago, substituting one heir for another to claim an inheritance or title they weren't entitled to. And Major Strange killed to keep that secret? Or someone else did, using Strange as their instrument? Tell me, Doctor, is there anyone currently living in St. Mary Mead who might have connections to the Strange family? Anyone who might have inherited not just Major Strange's blood, but his secrets? Dr. Haydock's face went pale. Good Lord, I never made the connection before, but Miss Marple, Major Strange's widow, before she remarried, was Eleanor Hartwell. Her sister's daughter married into the Fortescue family, and the Fortescues, Miss Marple finished grimly, have been prominent in this village for decades. Mr. Raymond Fortescue sits on the parish council. His wife, Constance, is president of the Women's Institute. And unless I'm very much mistaken, they live rather beyond their means for people with no visible source of substantial income. You think they know about this substitution? That they're protecting the secret? I think, Miss Marple said, rising to leave, that we must discover exactly what that secret is before anyone else dies for it. Thank you, Dr. Haydock. Your honesty, though belated, may yet serve justice." As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple's mind pieced together the puzzle. A substituted heir in 1743. A murder in 1944 to conceal that ancient fraud. Another murder in 1951 when someone came too close to the truth. And somewhere, hidden in Gossington Hall or in the possession of Major Strange's descendants, was the proof Captain Brendan had died to protect. The game was becoming dangerous. But Miss Marple had never shrunk from danger when justice was at stake. Chapter 7. The Fortescue Connection. Miss Marple's opportunity to observe the Fortescues came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, the Women's Institute held its monthly meeting at the village hall, with Mrs. Constance Fortescue presiding in her usual imperious manner. Miss Marple arrived early, positioning herself where she could study the woman without appearing to do so. Constance Fortescue was a striking woman in her late 40s, impeccably groomed with dark hair swept into an elegant chignon. She wore expensive jewellery, perhaps too expensive for someone whose husband's accounting practice was, by village standards, merely adequate. Her voice carried the cultivated tones of someone determined to be perceived as superior to her surroundings. "Ladies, order please," Mrs. Fortescue called, rapping her gavel. "We have much to discuss, including the summer fete arrangements and the rather unfortunate publicity our village has received due to recent events at Gossington Hall." Several women murmured uncomfortably. Mrs. Bantry, sitting beside Miss Marple, bristled visibly. "I hardly think," Dolly Bantry said sharply, "that a murder victim being discovered on my property constitutes unfortunate publicity. A man died, Constance. Show some respect." Mrs. Fortescue's smile was cold. "Of course, Dolly dear. Though one does wonder what a London solicitor was doing lurking about Gossington Hall in the middle of a snowstorm. Perhaps there were matters concerning the property that required investigation." The insinuation hung in the air. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, but her attention was wholly focused on the exchange. "If you have something to say, Constance, say it plainly," Mrs. Bantry demanded. "I merely observe that old houses often harbour old secrets. Gossington Hall has a rather interesting history, doesn't it? All those years requisitioned during the war, all those government people coming and going. Who knows what they might have hidden there? What they might have been searching for, even now?" Miss Marple spoke up quietly. "Are you suggesting, Mrs. Fortescue, that Mr. Blackwood was searching for something specific at Gossington Hall?" Mrs. Fortescue's eyes fixed on Miss Marple with unexpected intensity. "I'm suggesting, Miss Marple, that people who dig into the past often unearth things better left buried. History is rarely as simple as we've been taught. Families, titles, inheritances, all built on documents that might not bear close scrutiny." "How very philosophical," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I confess I'm curious how you came to such specific knowledge about Mr. Blackwood's interests. The police haven't released details of his investigation." A flush crept up Mrs. Fortescue's neck. "I know nothing specific. I'm merely speaking generally about the dangers of historical research." But she had revealed herself, Miss Marple thought. The question was whether she was protecting her own secret or someone else's. After the meeting, Miss Marple contrived to encounter Raymond Fortescue outside his High Street office. He was a precise man of 50, with thinning hair and the perpetually worried expression of someone burdened by hidden anxieties. "Mr. Fortescue, how fortunate! I wonder if you might spare a moment to discuss a small matter." Fortescue glanced at his watch nervously. I'm rather busy, Miss Marple. Perhaps another time. It concerns your family history. I'm helping to compile a genealogical record for the village archives, and I understand you have some interesting connections to the strange family of Wiltshire." Fortescue's face went white. "I don't know what you mean. My family has no connection to the Stranges." "Oh, but surely through your wife's family. Her mother was a Hartwell, wasn't she? And Eleanor Hartwell married Major Geoffrey Strange during the war." "That was my wife's great-aunt, a distant connection at best." "I fail to see what relevance." "Major Strange served at Gossington Hall in 1944, Miss Marple continued pleasantly. "He was there when Captain Richard Brendan died. Such a tragedy. Did your wife's great-aunt ever speak of that time?" Fortescue's hands trembled as he fumbled with his office keys. "Miss Marple, I really must insist. Mr. Fortescue, a man has been murdered. 2 men, if we count Captain Brendan. Both were investigating something connected to Major Strange and the documents he was handling at Gossington Hall. Now, you can speak with me, or you can speak with Inspector Slack. But speak you must, because I believe you know something about what those documents contained." For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might flee. Then, as if a string had been cut, Fortescue's shoulders sagged. "Come inside," he whispered, "quickly, before anyone sees us talking." His office was neat to the point of obsession, ledgers perfectly aligned, pens arranged by size, not a paper out of place. The office of a man desperate for control in a life spiralling beyond it. Fortescue sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. "My wife will never forgive me for this, but I can't live with the knowledge any more. Not after that solicitor was killed." "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently. "Eleanor Strange, Constance's great-aunt, died 2 years ago. She left Constance a sealed box with instructions that it should never be opened, never be revealed to anyone. But Constance, my wife, is curious by nature, ambitious. She opened it. What did she find? Letters, documents, a confession of sorts from Major Strange, written shortly before his death." Fortescue looked up, his eyes haunted. "Major Strange was dying, Miss Marple. His heart condition was real, but he knew he had only months to live. The documents contained his account of what happened at Gossington Hall in 1944, what Captain Brendan discovered, and why Strange killed him for it." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained calm. "What did Captain Brendan discover?" "In 1743, Laurent Beaumont, the Chevalier de Rossignol, fled France under mysterious circumstances. He came to England and somehow assumed a new identity. He became Lawrence Strange, younger son of the Strange family. But he wasn't really Lawrence Strange. The real Lawrence had died of fever in France, where he'd been travelling. Beaumont assumed his identity, returned to England, and claimed the Strange inheritance when the elder brother died without issue." "A complete substitution," Miss Marple breathed. "The entire Strange family line from 1743 onward was built on a fraud." "Worse than that. Beaumont, posing as Lawrence Strange, eventually married into the Gossington family. His daughter became the wife of Sir Henry Gossington in 1768. That means the Gossington Bantry line itself has French blood, not English, and the title and estates were obtained through deception. And the proof of all this was in the documents Captain Brendan was analysing. Birth certificates, letters, a confession that Beaumont had written but never sent. Captain Brendan pieced it all together. He was going to expose it, which would have destroyed not only the Strange family's reputation, but also called into question the legitimacy of the Gossington inheritance. Fortescue's voice dropped. Major Strange's great-grandfather was a Gossington. He stood to lose everything if the fraud was revealed, not just family honour, but potential legal claims to the estate. So he killed Captain Brendan and destroyed the evidence. But not all of it, Miss Marple said. Otherwise, why would Edmund Blackwood's investigation have posed a threat? That's what Constance believes. She thinks some of the original documents survived, hidden somewhere in Gossington Hall. When she learned that a solicitor was asking questions about the 1944 murder, she panicked. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Fortescue, did your wife have anything to do with Edmund Blackwood's death?" "No, at least I don't think so." His certainty wavered. "She's been acting strangely since December. Secretive, anxious. She burned Major Strange's confession. I saw her do it in our fireplace. She said we had to protect the family, that the truth could never come out." "Why would your wife care so deeply about protecting the Strange family's reputation?" Fortescue's laugh was bitter. "Because Major Strange's son, Geoffrey Jr., is Constance's second cousin. And Geoffrey has promised Constance that if the family secret remains safe, he'll make us his heirs. He's worth millions, Miss Marple, all built on investments and banking, but funded originally by money that came from the fraudulent Strange inheritance. If the substitution is exposed, the entire fortune could be contested in court. Where is Geoffrey Strange Jr. now? He lives in London, but—" Fortescue paused. "But he was in the area in December. He visited us on December 13th, stayed overnight, left the next morning, the morning of the snowstorm, the morning Edmund Blackwood came to St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple felt the pieces clicking into place. "Mr. Fortescue, did Geoffrey Strange know that Mr. Blackwood was coming?" "I don't know, but Constance received a telephone call that morning, before Geoffrey left. I heard her say he mustn't find it and do whatever is necessary. When I asked her about it afterward, she said it was nothing, just Women's Institute business." "One final question. Where were you and your wife on December 15th, the day Mr. Blackwood died?" Fortescue's face was grey. "We were both at home, or rather I was. Constance went out for a walk in the afternoon, despite the snow. She said she needed air. She was gone for nearly 2 hours. When she came back, she was wet and shaken, said she'd fallen near the old mill pond. But Miss Marple—" His voice broke. "The mill pond is in the opposite direction from Gossington Hall. And when I hung up her coat to dry, I found mud on it that looked like it came from a garden, not a pond." Outside, church bells chimed 5 o'clock. Miss Marple rose, her mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. "Thank you, Mr. Fortescue. You've been very brave. I suggest you say nothing of this conversation to your wife until I've had a chance to verify certain facts. And Mr. Fortescue, keep yourself safe. Whoever killed twice won't hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened." As Miss Marple walked home through the deepening twilight, she knew the net was tightening. But the question remained, was Constance Fortescue a killer, or merely an accessory to murder? And was Geoffrey Strange Jr. the true architect of Edmund Blackwood's death? The answer, she suspected, still lay hidden somewhere in Gossington Hall, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 8. The Hidden Library. Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall the following morning, having arranged with Mrs. Bantry to examine the library where Captain Brendan had made his fateful discovery. Inspector Slack and Colonel Melchett accompanied her, both men having learned to respect her insights despite their initial skepticism. The library was a magnificent room, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. tall windows overlooked the gardens where Thomas Eccles worked among the spring bulbs. And the morning sun cast geometric patterns across the Persian carpet. The government cleared out most of their papers when they left in 1945, Mrs. Bantry explained. But Arthur found some documents stuffed behind the shelving when we renovated in 1947. Old estate records mostly. Deeds, bills of sale, correspondence going back to the 17th century. He stored them in those cabinets. She gestured to a series of wooden filing cabinets along the far wall. Miss Marple approached the cabinets thoughtfully. Mrs. Bantry, in 1944, where exactly were these historical documents kept? According to the inventory we received when the government returned the property, they were using this entire room. They'd brought in additional filing systems, sorting tables, even photographic equipment for copying documents. Everything was removed when they left. Not quite everything, Miss Marple murmured, running her fingers along the ornate moulding that framed the built-in bookshelves. Libraries in houses of this period often had hidden compartments, priest holes, secret panels, spaces for concealing valuables during troubled times. Colonel Melchett looked skeptical. You think something might still be hidden here after all these years? I think Captain Brendan was too intelligent to leave incriminating evidence where Major Strange could easily find it. If he discovered something explosive, he might have hidden it before confronting anyone. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room systematically. Mr. Eccles said Captain Brendan was excited when he left the library that night, perhaps excited because he'd secured his evidence in a safe place. Inspector Slack began methodically tapping panels and pressing decorative rosettes. Colonel Melchett examined the fireplace surround, while Mrs. Bantry watched with growing fascination. Miss Marple, however, stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on a portrait hanging above the mantelpiece. It showed a stern-faced gentleman in 18th-century dress, with a plaque reading Sir Lawrence Strange, 1720-1789. Mrs. Bantry, how long has this portrait hung here? Heavens, I'm not certain. It was here when Arthur's father owned the house. It's been in the family for generations. An ancestor through marriage, I believe. Why do you ask? Because, Miss Marple said softly, approaching the portrait. This is the man who wasn't really Lawrence Strange at all. This is Laurent Beaumont, the French impostor. She studied the painting closely. The artist had captured remarkable detail. The subject's eyes held a hint of wariness, and his fingers were positioned oddly on the arm of his chair, almost as if pointing toward something. Inspector Slack, would you help me take this portrait down? Together they lifted the heavy frame from its hooks. Behind it, the wallpaper was darker where the portrait had protected it from sunlight. But there was something else. A small irregularity in the wainscoting at shoulder height. Miss Marple pressed it gently. Nothing happened. She tried sliding it sideways, then pulling. Still nothing. Perhaps it's just a flaw in the wood, Melchett suggested. But Miss Marple was examining the portrait frame itself now, running her fingers along its gilded edges. The fingers in the painting, she murmured. They're positioned at an angle, as if, yes. She found a small carved rose in the frame's corner and pressed it. A soft click echoed through the library. The panel in the wainscoting swung outward, revealing a narrow cavity within the wall. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Inspector Slack immediately reached into the opening and withdrew a leather portfolio, stiff with age and spotted with mildew. Careful, Miss Marple cautioned. Those documents may be quite fragile. They cleared a space on the library table, and Slack carefully opened the portfolio. Inside were several yellow documents, their ink faded but still legible, and a notebook bound in red leather. Captain Brendan's missing notebook. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she opened the notebook. Captain Brendan's neat handwriting filled the pages with observations, translations, and conclusions. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "October 20th, 1944. I have discovered incontrovertible proof that the man known as Sir Lawrence Strange was born Laurent Beaumont in Versailles, 1718. His substitution for the real Lawrence Strange occurred in Lyon, 1743, where the genuine Strange died of typhus while touring. Beaumont, facing gambling debts and scandal in France, assumed Strange's identity using forged letters of introduction and genuine Strange family documents he'd somehow acquired, possibly through theft or bribery of a servant." She turned pages carefully. "The proof lies in 3 documents. First, a letter from Beaumont's sister in Paris dated 1745, addressing him as Laurent and begging him to return to France now that his troubles had passed. She was clearly unaware of his imposture. Second, her confession written by Beaumont himself in 1785, 4 years before his death, possibly intended for a priest but never delivered. In it, he expresses remorse for his deception, but fears the consequences of revelation would destroy his children and grandchildren. Third, a baptismal certificate from Versailles showing Laurent Beaumont's birth, with identifying marks, a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder, confirmed in a medical journal entry by the Strange family physician who noted the same mark on Sir Lawrence when treating him for gout in 1770. "Good heavens," Mrs. Bantry whispered, "it's all here. The complete proof of the substitution." Colonel Melchett examined the documents themselves, brittle papers covered in 18th-century French script, along with English translations in what must have been Captain Brendan's hand. "But why hide all this?" Slack demanded. "Why not simply report it to his superiors?" Miss Marple continued reading from the notebook. "October 28th, 1944. I have made a terrible error. After confirming my findings, I mentioned them to Major Strange this evening, thinking he would be as fascinated as I am by this historical discovery. I was a fool. Major Strange's face went white when I showed him the genealogical charts connecting his family to Beaumont. He demanded I give him all the documents immediately. When I refused, explaining they were historically significant and must be properly archived, he became threatening." The final entry made Miss Marple's voice catch. "I've hidden the documents where Strange will never find them, behind his own ancestor's portrait, a fitting irony. I'm going to London tomorrow to report this matter to my commanding officer, but first I must collect my thoughts and secure my notebook. If anything should happen to me, let this record show that Major Geoffrey Strange has every motive to—" The entry ended abruptly, the sentence unfinished. "He never got to complete it," Miss Marple said softly. "Major Strange killed him that very night." Inspector Slack was examining another document from the portfolio, a letter on heavy cream paper, dated December 1951. "Miss Marple, look at this. It's addressed to Edmund Blackwood, Esquire, Lincoln's Inn, London." Miss Marple took the letter carefully. It was written in an educated hand. "Dear Mr. Blackwood, you do not know me, but I have information concerning your investigation into the death of Captain Richard Brendan. I was present at Gossington Hall in 1944 and know where certain documents proving Captain Brendan's discoveries can be found. Meet me at the old fountain behind Gossington Hall on December 15th at 3 p.m. Come alone. I am afraid for my life and cannot risk being seen with you publicly. I will bring Captain Brendan's notebook and the proof you seek. Burn this letter after reading." "It's not signed," Slack observed. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but notice the handwriting. Educated, possibly feminine, with distinctive loops on the capital letters. And the paper, expensive, with a watermark. She held it up to the light. It's the same stationery used by the Women's Institute for official correspondence. I recognize it because I receive their notices regularly. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. But that means, Miss Marple said grimly. The letter was written by someone with access to Women's Institute stationery, and we know who presides over that organization. Constance Fortescue, Colonel Melchett breathed. She lured Blackwood here and killed him. Or had him killed, Miss Marple corrected. Remember, Geoffrey Strange Jr. was in the area that day, and Mrs. Fortescue couldn't have known about these hidden documents. She's never had access to Gossington Hall's library. Someone told her where they were. Someone who'd been here in 1944. A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Thomas Eccles stood there, his weathered face pale, a gardening trowel trembling in his hand. I told her, he said hoarsely. God forgive me. I told her where Captain Brendan hid those documents. I thought she wanted to help bring the truth to light. She came to me in December, said she'd received information that Mr. Blackwood was investigating the captain's death, said we could finally get justice. She asked if I knew where the proof might be hidden. I remembered seeing the captain examine that portrait the day before he died. Remembered the way he smiled at it, like it held a secret. I told Mrs. Fortescue about it. And she used that information to set a trap, Miss Marple said quietly. She wrote to Mr. Blackwood, offering him the very evidence he sought, arranging a meeting in an isolated location, but she never intended to give him the documents. She intended to ensure he never found them, and to silence him permanently. Eccles's face crumpled. I've been such a fool. When I found his body, I knew immediately what had happened. But I was too frightened to speak. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all go away. Instead, I helped a murderer escape justice, just as I did 8 years ago. You can help now, Miss Marple told him gently. You can testify to what you know. But first, Inspector, I suggest we move quickly. If Mrs. Fortescue realizes we've found these documents, she may attempt to flee or worse, to destroy evidence, and we still don't know if she acted alone or if Geoffrey Strange Jr. was the actual killer. Inspector Slack was already moving toward the door, barking orders to the constables waiting outside. Colonel Melchett carefully gathered the precious documents while Mrs. Bantry stood by the window, watching Eccles return to his garden with the weight of 8 years' guilt finally beginning to lift. Jane, Mrs. Bantry said softly, do you really think Constance Fortescue capable of murder? She's so proper, so concerned with appearances. Miss Marple joined her at the window, watching the peaceful spring morning unfold over St. Mary Mead's gardens and cottages. That, my dear Dolly, she said quietly, is precisely what makes her dangerous. People obsessed with reputation and appearances will do terrible things to protect them. Constance Fortescue saw a fortune slipping through her fingers. A fortune built on fraud, yes, but a fortune nonetheless. And she decided that 2 more deaths were an acceptable price to pay for maintaining the lie. Outside, church bells rang the hour. Time, Miss Marple thought, for the final confrontation. Chapter 9. The Confession. The arrest of Constance Fortescue occurred with surprising swiftness. Inspector Slack, accompanied by 2 constables, arrived at the Larches just as Mrs. Fortescue was supervising the loading of several trunks into a motor car. Her husband stood nearby, wringing his hands in obvious distress. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Fortescue?" Slack inquired pleasantly. Constance Fortescue's composure wavered for only a moment. "My cousin in London is unwell. I'm going to attend to her. Surely that's not a crime, Inspector." "No, but murder is. Constance Fortescue, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Edmund Blackwood, and as an accessory to the murder of Captain Richard Brendan." The colour drained from her face, but she drew herself up with dignity. "This is preposterous. I demand to see my solicitor." "All in good time. For now, you'll accompany us to the station." By early afternoon, Miss Marple, Colonel Melchett, and Horace Vine had assembled in the small interview room at the Much Benham police station. Constance Fortescue sat across the table, her expensive suit now looking incongruous in the stark surroundings. Her solicitor, a nervous young man from the local firm, sat beside her. "My client maintains her complete innocence," the solicitor began. "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "she won't mind explaining how her stationery was used to lure Edmund Blackwood to his death." Mrs. Fortescue's eyes flickered. "Anyone could have taken paper from the Women's Institute office. It's hardly secure." "True," Miss Marple agreed. "But the handwriting on the letter matches samples we've obtained from your personal correspondence, your shopping lists, your notes to the vicar. Inspector Slack has already sent them to a graphologist in London. Handwriting can be forged." "Indeed it can. But tell me, Mrs. Fortescue, where were you on the afternoon of December 15th? Your husband says you went for a walk and returned wet and shaken, claiming you'd fallen near the mill pond. Yet, witnesses place you near Gossington Hall at approximately 3 o'clock, the exact time Edmund Blackwood was killed." For the first time, genuine fear showed in Constance Fortescue's eyes. "What witnesses? You're bluffing." Colonel Melchett leaned forward. "A delivery boy cycling past Gossington Hall saw a woman in a burgundy coat, the same colour you were wearing that day, hurrying away from the fountain area. The boy knows you by sight, Mrs. Fortescue. You've scolded him more than once for riding too fast past your house." The solicitor whispered urgently in his client's ear, but Mrs. Fortescue shook her head impatiently. "Even if I was near Gossington Hall, that proves nothing. Perhaps I was taking a walk. In a blizzard." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "How peculiar. And even more peculiar that you chose to walk in the gardens behind the hall, private property after all, at the precise moment Mr. Blackwood was being killed there. Unless, of course, you knew he would be there, because you arranged the meeting." Horace Vine opened Edmund Blackwood's journal. "Your letter to my partner promised him Captain Brendan's notebook and proof of the substitution. You knew about these documents because Thomas Eccles told you where Captain Brendan had hidden them. But you never intended to give them to Mr. Blackwood, did you? You intended to kill him before he could find them himself. This is all circumstantial." Mrs. Fortescue's voice rose shrilly. "You have no proof I killed anyone." "Actually," Inspector Slack said, producing a sealed evidence bag, "we have this." He placed it on the table. Inside was a woman's leather glove, expensive and well made, with the initial CF embroidered on the inside cuff. "Found in the fountain after the snow melted, near where Blackwood's body lay. Your glove, I believe. You lost it during the struggle." Mrs. Fortescue stared at the glove as if it were a serpent. Her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she whispered. "He wasn't supposed to die." Her solicitor grabbed her arm. "Mrs. Fortescue, I strongly advise—" "No!" She shook him off violently. I'm tired of the lies, tired of the fear. Do you know what it's like living with this secret, knowing that at any moment someone might uncover the truth and destroy everything?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Tell us what happened, Mrs. Fortescue. The truth, however painful, is preferable to uncertainty." Constance Fortescue's hands twisted in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was dull, defeated. "Geoffrey Strange came to us in early December. He'd learned through his business connections that a London solicitor was investigating the 1944 death at Gossington Hall. Geoffrey was terrified. His entire fortune is built on investments seeded with money from the Strange inheritance, money that came from Laurent Beaumont's fraud. If the substitution was proven, creditors and claimants could tie up his assets in court for decades. He would be ruined. So he asked you to help stop Blackwood's investigation," Colonel Melchett prompted. "Not asked, commanded. Geoffrey can be very persuasive when he wants something. He reminded me that without his patronage, Raymond and I would have nothing. No comfortable home, no social position, no hope for our old age. He said if I truly wanted to be his heir, I needed to prove my loyalty to the family." "By committing murder," Miss Marple said quietly. "By protecting the family secret. That's how Geoffrey phrased it. He made it sound noble. Necessary." Tears began streaming down Constance Fortescue's face. "I went to Thomas Eccles, convinced him I wanted justice for Captain Brendan. He told me about the portrait, about where the documents might be hidden. Then I wrote to Mr. Blackwood, using Women's Institute paper so it couldn't be traced to me personally. I offered him exactly what he wanted, the notebook, the proof. All he had to do was come to Gossington Hall." "But you never intended to give him the documents," Vine said. "I couldn't if he got them. Geoffrey would be exposed, and we would lose everything. I thought I could reason with Mr. Blackwood, perhaps bribe him to stop his investigation. I brought money, £200. I was prepared to offer more." "Yet you also brought a weapon," Slack observed. Mrs. Jane Fortescue's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "A stone, a large stone from my garden, wrapped in cloth and hidden in my coat pocket. Geoffrey told me I might need to ensure Mr. Blackwood's cooperation. I didn't want to believe I could actually use it." "But you did. He wouldn't listen." The words burst out in anguish. "I met him at the fountain as arranged. I tried to explain that his investigation was destroying innocent lives, that ancient frauds should be allowed to rest peacefully. He refused. He said justice demanded the truth be revealed, that Captain Brendan's death couldn't be allowed to go unavenged. He said he would search Gossington Hall himself if necessary, that he would expose everyone connected to the cover-up, including me if I tried to stop him." Mrs. Fortescue's hands were shaking uncontrollably now. "He turned his back on me, started walking toward the hall. I panicked. All I could think was that Geoffrey would abandon us, that we would lose everything, that I would become nothing again. Just plain Constance Hartwell. From the shabby genteel family with more pride than pennies. The stone was in my hand before I realized what I was doing. I struck him once, on the back of the head. He fell so quickly, so quietly. There was snow falling, covering everything in white, making it all seem unreal, like a dream." "Except it wasn't a dream," Miss Marple said. "Edmund Blackwood died in that fountain, alone and betrayed by someone he'd trusted to help him. I didn't know he was dead at first. I dragged him to the fountain, I don't know why, instinct perhaps, to hide what I'd done. The snow was falling so heavily. I thought perhaps it would cover everything, make it look like an accident. I lost my glove in the struggle. I was too frightened to search for it, too desperate to escape before someone saw me." "And you went home and told your husband you'd fallen near the mill pond," Colonel Melchett said. Raymond suspected. I could see it in his eyes. But he said nothing, and I said nothing, and we lived with our terrible secret. She looked up, her face haggard, until the snow melted and the body was found. Then I knew it was only a matter of time. Inspector Slack leaned back, his expression grim. What about Geoffrey Strange? Was he involved in the actual killing? No, he was in London that day, but he knew what I planned to do. He encouraged it, told me I was protecting the family, that I would be rewarded for my loyalty. Her laugh was bitter. I telephoned him after I'd done it, told him it was finished. Do you know what he said? He said, "Good. Now we can all sleep peacefully." Peacefully? I haven't slept properly since December. Miss Marple studied the broken woman across the table. Mrs. Fortescue, what about Major Strange's death in 1947? Was that natural? Constance Fortescue's eyes widened. I don't know anything about that. I was barely out of school in 1947, but Geoffrey once mentioned, when he'd had too much brandy, that his father's death had been convenient timing. He wouldn't elaborate, but the way he said it. She shuddered. I've sometimes wondered if Geoffrey arranged that death too, eliminating the one person who could directly link him to Captain Brendan's murder. The room fell silent. Outside, the sounds of Much Benham's afternoon traffic filtered through the window, ordinary life continuing while extraordinary revelations unfolded within. Mrs. Fortescue, Colonel Melchett said formally, you will be charged with the murder of Edmund Blackwood. Inspector Slack, send officers to London immediately to arrest Geoffrey Strange Jr. as an accessory before the fact, and contact Scotland Yard. They'll want to reopen the investigation into Major Strange's death. As the constable led Constance Fortescue away, she paused at the door, looking back at Miss Marple. I'm not a bad person, she said, her voice breaking. I just wanted security, respect, a place in the world. Is that so terrible? Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. Everyone wants those things, Mrs. Fortescue, but most of us don't kill for them. You made a choice, the wrong choice, and now you must face the consequences. After the door closed, Horace Vine gathered his papers with trembling hands. At least Edmund's death will be avenged, and Captain Brendan's death, though it comes 8 years too late. Justice delayed, Miss Marple murmured, but not denied, though I confess I shall not rest entirely easy until Geoffrey Strange is in custody. He is, in many ways, the true architect of all this misery. We'll have him within hours, Slack assured her. Scotland Yard is very efficient. But Miss Marple, looking out the window at the peaceful Hampshire countryside, felt a lingering unease. In her experience, clever criminals rarely submitted to arrest without a fight. And Geoffrey Strange Jr., she suspected, was very clever indeed. Chapter 10. Justice Restored. 3 days later, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room with Mrs. Bantry, Colonel Melchett, and Inspector Slack, reviewing the final pieces of the puzzle. The spring afternoon was warm, and through the open window came the scent of lilacs and the cheerful sounds of village life resuming its normal rhythm. Geoffrey Strange Jr. was arrested yesterday evening at Dover, Colonel Melchett reported, attempting to board a ferry to Calais. He had false identity papers and a substantial amount of cash. When confronted, he attempted to bribe the arresting officers, which rather sealed his fate. Has he confessed? Mrs. Bantry asked eagerly. Not directly, but his solicitors are negotiating. They're claiming he merely advised Mrs. Fortescue that he had no direct involvement in either murder. Melchard's expression was sceptical. However, Scotland Yard has uncovered some interesting financial records. Geoffrey made a payment of £5,000 to a Dr. Marcus Webb in 1947. A physician struck off the medical register for falsifying death certificates. Webb died in 1949, conveniently taking his secrets with him. So Geoffrey did arrange his father's death, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Major Strange was dying, yes, but not quickly enough for Geoffrey's purposes. With Webb's help, he hastened the process. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. We've also found correspondence between Geoffrey and Mrs. Fortescue dating back to November 1951. In one letter, Geoffrey writes quite explicitly that obstacles to family security must be removed by any means necessary. That should be sufficient to establish conspiracy to murder. What will happen to Raymond Fortescue? Mrs. Bantry inquired. Poor man seemed genuinely horrified by his wife's actions. He's cooperating fully with our investigation, Slack replied. He'll likely face charges of accessory after the fact for helping conceal evidence, but given his cooperation, the sentence should be light. He's already filed for divorce. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a gentle clink. And the documents themselves? Captain Brendan's evidence of the substitution. Colonel Melchard smiled. That's produced an interesting legal situation. The documents have been authenticated by experts from the British Museum. Laurent Beaumont's substitution for Lawrence Strange in 1743 is now a proven historical fact. However, the legal implications are complex. How so? The fraud occurred over 200 years ago. All the principals are long dead. The current Gossington estate was purchased legally by Colonel Bantry's family in 1889, long after any statute of limitations would have expired. The Strange family fortune, while originally built on fraudulent inheritance, has been so transformed through subsequent generations of legitimate business dealings that untangling it would be impossible. So no one will be held accountable for the original fraud. Mrs. Bantry seemed disappointed. The original fraud, no, Miss Marple said, but the murders committed to conceal it, those will be punished. Captain Brendan and Edmund Blackwood will have justice, which is what matters. As for Laurent Beaumont's deception, history will record it. The Strange family name, which Geoffrey valued so highly, will be forever tainted by the revelation of its fraudulent origins. That, I think, would have given Captain Brendan some satisfaction. There's one more thing, Melchard added. Thomas Eccles came to see me yesterday. He's resigned his position at Gossington Hall. Says he can't bear to stay after everything that's happened. But he asked me to thank you, Miss Marple, for helping him finally tell the truth. Where will he go? His sister has a small farm in Devon. He plans to help her there, try to find some peace in his remaining years. Melchard's voice softened. He said that for 8 years he's been haunted by Captain Brendan's ghost. Now perhaps both he and the captain can rest. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Haydock. The elderly physician looked years younger than he had during their previous conversation, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I've just come from the Chief Constable's office, he announced. I've given a complete statement about my falsification of Captain Brendan's death certificate in 1944. I expect I'll face professional censure, possibly even criminal charges for obstruction of justice. That took courage, Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple said warmly. Belated courage. I should have spoken up 8 years ago, but I'm speaking now, and I've submitted my resignation from the medical register. At 70, it's time I retired anyway. Perhaps I can spend my remaining years trying to make amends. He pulled an envelope from his pocket. I've also written to Captain Brendan's sister, Mrs. Helena Cartwright, explaining what really happened to her brother. She deserves to know the truth. I'm sure that will bring her some comfort, Miss Marple replied. Her brother was a brave man who died seeking justice. That he succeeded, even posthumously, is a tribute to his memory. After Dr. Haydock departed, the group sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mrs. Bantry spoke. Jane, how did you know? What made you suspect Constance Fortescue specifically? Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. Several small things, my dear, which taken together formed a pattern. First, her comment at the Women's Institute meeting about secrets being better left buried. Too specific, too pointed for someone genuinely ignorant of the situation. Second, her obvious anxiety when I mentioned the strange family connection. Third, the expensive jewellery she wore, far beyond what her husband's income could support. Someone was funding that lifestyle, and Geoffrey Strange was the obvious candidate. But couldn't those things be explained innocently? Perhaps, but there was also her handwriting on the letter to Edmund Blackwood, the distinctive loops, the expensive stationery. I recognized it immediately when Inspector Slack showed me the letter. And finally, there was simple human nature. Human nature. I've observed, Dolly, that people obsessed with social position and appearances often harbour the deepest insecurities. Constance Fortescue spent her entire life trying to escape her modest origins, trying to be someone she wasn't. In that way, she was not unlike Laurent Beaumont himself, willing to perpetrate any fraud, tell any lie, commit any crime to maintain a false identity. Miss Marple gazed out the window at the peaceful village. It's rather sad, really. If she'd been content with what she had, honest about who she was, she might have lived a perfectly happy life. Instead, she destroyed herself, chasing an illusion. Colonel Melchett rose to leave, followed by Inspector Slack. At the door, Melchett paused. Miss Marple, I don't know how you do it. You see things the rest of us miss, understand motivations that escape us entirely. The police force could use someone with your insights. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I'm quite content observing village life, Colonel. After all, St. Mary Mead contains all of human nature in miniature, the good and the bad, the noble and the venal. One need not travel far to understand the depths of which people are capable. After they'd gone, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry sat together in the fading afternoon light. It's finally over, Mrs. Bantry sighed, though I must say I'll never look at that fountain the same way again. Perhaps you should have it filled with flowers, Miss Marple suggested. Plant something beautiful where something terrible happened. Life continuing despite death. There's hope in that. That's a lovely idea. What do you think? Roses? Roses would be perfect. And perhaps a small plaque remembering Captain Richard Brendan and Edmund Blackwood. Not their deaths, but their dedication to truth and justice. That's the legacy that should endure. As the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had consumed the past weeks. 2 murders, 8 years apart, connected by a thread of greed, deception, and pride stretching back 2 centuries. Captain Brendan had discovered a historical truth and died for it. Edmund Blackwood had sought to expose that truth and met the same fate. But in the end, truth had prevailed. The snow had melted, and the secret had surfaced, just as she'd known it would. Secrets always did, eventually. Human nature being what it was, the desire to conceal was eventually overwhelmed by the need for truth to emerge. "What are you thinking about, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "I was thinking," Miss Marple replied, resuming her knitting, "about Laurent Beaumont, living his entire life as someone else, Never able to relax, never able to be himself. What a terrible existence that must have been. And then his descendants, inheriting not just his fortune, but his fear, his need to protect the lie at any cost. Generation after generation, trapped by one man's fraud. Do you think Geoffrey Strange knew about the substitution all along? I suspect Major Strange told him on his deathbed. A final burden passed from father to son. Geoffrey grew up knowing his family's position was built on sand. That discovery meant ruin. When Captain Brendan threatened to expose the truth, Major Strange eliminated him. When the threat arose again with Edmund Blackwood, Geoffrey ensured history repeated itself. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. The tragedy is that by 1951, the secret hardly mattered anymore. The Strange fortune had been legitimately rebuilt through business acumen. The revelation would have been embarrassing, but not financially devastating. If Geoffrey had simply ignored Blackwood's investigation, allowed the historical truth to be published, he would have weathered the scandal easily. But fear made him act, and action brought destruction. So in trying to protect his position, he destroyed it completely. Precisely. It's rather like a Greek tragedy. Fate fulfilled through the very actions taken to avoid it. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at her friend with deep affection. But that's enough philosophy for one day. Tell me, how is Colonel Bantry managing all this excitement? Mrs. Bantry laughed. Arthur, he's thoroughly enjoying being at the centre of a famous case. He's already planning to give tours of the library and the fountain, telling everyone about the Gossington Hall murders. I suspect we'll be hosting curious visitors for years. Then something good has come of it. Arthur has found a new enthusiasm in his retirement. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the two friends talked of pleasant things. The upcoming church fort, Miss Knight's latest culinary disasters, the new family moving into the old vicarage. Life, as it always did, continued. But that evening, before retiring to bed, Miss Marple stood at her window, looking toward Gossington Hall, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. She thought of Captain Brendan, young and brilliant, dying in pursuit of truth. She thought of Edmund Blackwood, seeking justice for a stranger, meeting the same fate. She thought of Constance Fortescue, now awaiting trial, her dreams of grandeur turned to ashes. And she thought of Thomas Eccles, finally unburdened of his terrible secret, beginning a new life in Devon. Perhaps that was the truest victory, not punishment for the guilty, but peace for the innocent who had suffered in silence. When the snow melted, the secret surfaced, Miss Marple murmured to herself, and in surfacing, it brought justice to those who had waited 8 long years for it. She drew the curtains, settled into her favourite chair, and picked up her knitting. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept peacefully under the spring stars. The village had weathered another storm, survived another scandal. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new problems, new examples of human nature at its best and worst. But tonight, Miss Jane Marple was content. Justice, however delayed, had finally been served. The end. In memory of Captain Richard Brendan and Edmund Blackwood, seekers of truth who paid the ultimate price for their dedication to justice.